She had destroyed 11 assistants in 10 months. Some lasted hours, one lasted 40 minutes. The employment agencies had started refusing her calls. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, a single father with an empty bank account and a 7-year-old daughter counting on him walked through her front door. Not because he believed he could survive her, but because he had absolutely no other choice. What happened next would cost them both everything they thought they knew about pain, pride, and what it means to let another person in. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Part 1. The rain came down hard that morning. The kind that didn't care about umbrellas or good intentions, the kind that soaked through a jacket in under 30 seconds and left a person standing in a puddle inside their own shoes. Ethan Brooks stood on the sidewalk outside the address on his phone and looked up at the building and felt the particular sensation of being somewhere he probably shouldn't be. It wasn't a house. It was a statement. 5 stories of glass and pale stone rising above the street in the kind of neighborhood where people didn't put their trash cans out until the morning of pickup because they didn't want to ruin the aesthetics. The kind of neighborhood where every shrub had been professionally shaped into something geometrically perfect. The kind of neighborhood Ethan had driven through 100 times without ever stopping, because people like him didn't stop there. They passed through. They delivered packages, maybe. Then they left. He checked the address again. Checked the job listing he'd printed out the night before, the paper already going soft and translucent from the rain. Personal assistant to Ms. Victoria Sterling. Immediate start. Competitive salary. Discretion required. Candidates must be available full-time, 7 days per week for the first month. No exceptions. The salary figure at the bottom of the page was the reason he was standing here in wet shoes at 7:45 in the morning on a Tuesday. It was the reason he hadn't turned around after the woman at the employment agency gave him a look he could only describe as pity, wrapped in bureaucratic professionalism. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Brooks," she'd said, her voice dropping like she was about to share a terminal diagnosis. "This position has been challenging to fill." "How many applicants?" "Placed." "How many have we placed?" She corrected him with the precision of someone who found accuracy comforting. "We've placed 11 individuals in this role over the past 10 months, and none of them are still employed there." He'd asked her what happened. She'd looked at the file folder on her desk instead of at him, which told him everything he needed to know about the kind of answer she was about to give. The client has very high standards. High standards that fired 11 people in 10 months. "Resigned," she said carefully. "Most of them resigned. He took the job anyway. He took the job because Sophie's school tuition was 3 weeks overdue, and the landlord had stopped pretending the rent notices were reminders and started leaving them under the door at night. He took the job because his truck needed 2 new tires, and the check engine light had been on since February, and it was now September, and he'd been telling himself it was probably nothing for 7 months. He took the job because he was 32 years old, and he had a 7-year-old daughter who still believed he had everything figured out, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as humanly possible. He pressed the intercom button at the gate. Silence. Then a voice. Female, clipped, carrying the exact tone of someone who had been interrupted from something more important. "You're late." He glanced at his phone. 7:46. "My appointment is at 8. I said 7:45 in the confirmation email." He hadn't gotten a confirmation email. He'd gotten the offer letter and the address and the instruction to arrive at 8. He knew arguing about this wouldn't accomplish anything, so he didn't. "I apologize," he said. "I'm here now." A pause. The gate buzzed open. The front door was opened by a woman in her late 50s with careful eyes and the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to make themselves very small. She introduced herself as Mrs. Paulson, the housekeeper, in a voice just above a whisper, and she led him through a foyer that was all clean lines and expensive emptiness into a wide hallway that opened into an office space that took up most of the ground floor. And there, behind a desk that probably cost more than Ethan's truck, was Victoria Sterling. He'd looked her up the night before. There wasn't much to find that wasn't buried under the kind of corporate language that said everything and nothing at the same time. Profiles about the company she'd founded at 26, the acquisition of a smaller firm at 28, the industry awards, the Forbes feature. What he hadn't found, at least not easily, was anything about the accident. That part lived in a shorter, older article, 3 paragraphs, mostly focused on the company and what would happen to it rather than what had happened to her. The accident had been 18 months ago. A collision on the interstate, the kind that happened in the wrong second on the wrong morning. She'd been the passenger. She'd survived. Her fiancé at the time had walked away without a scratch, which Ethan now understood, given everything, must have carried its own kind of weight. She was in a wheelchair. He'd known that from the listing, from the agency, from the article. Knowing it and seeing it were different, though not in the way he'd expected. What struck him first wasn't the wheelchair. It was her posture, the rigid, deliberate straightness of her spine, the way she held her shoulders, the way she looked at him with the studied neutrality of someone performing the act of not caring about your impression. She was, objectively, striking. Dark hair pulled back without a single strand out of place. A gray blouse that probably had a name he wouldn't recognize. Reading glasses she hadn't bothered to take off yet. No jewelry, no softness anywhere on her face. "You're wet," she said. "It's raining." "I can see that." She looked at the water dripping from his jacket onto her floor. "Take it off. Leave it by the door. Mrs. Paulson will deal with it." He did. He came back to stand in front of her desk, and she looked at him the way you looked at something you were trying to decide whether to buy or put back on the shelf. "Your resume is ordinary," she said. He waited. "Administrative support, logistics coordination, property management assistant. Nothing particularly impressive." She set down the papers. "You have a child." "I do." "That wasn't disclosed in your application." "The listing didn't ask about it." "It's relevant." "I don't see how." Her eyes sharpened slightly. Not anger. More like recalibration. The expression of someone who hadn't expected pushback and was now deciding what to do with it. "Children create complications," she said. "School pickups, sick days, emergencies. I've had assistants leave in the middle of critical work because of a fever or a school play. I need someone whose attention isn't divided." "My daughter is 7 and she's healthy," Ethan said. "Her school has aftercare until 6. My mother lives 12 minutes away and she's available for emergencies. I've already arranged coverage for every scenario I can anticipate. If something comes up I haven't anticipated, I'll handle it without it affecting your schedule." Victoria looked at him for a moment. "You prepared for this conversation." "I prepared for this job." She picked up the resume again, set it back down. "The last 11 people I employed in this position were all, on paper, more qualified than you." "I know. And yet you're here." "I need the work." Something shifted in her expression. He couldn't name it. It came and went too fast, something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite interest. "At least you're honest about it," she said. Most of them claimed to be passionate about executive support. She said it with the exhaustion of someone who had heard that sentence too many times. "Sit down. I'll walk you through the expectations." She walked him through them for 45 minutes, and they were, in the most clinical sense of the word, insane. She needed her calendar managed across 3 time zones simultaneously because she had investors in London, a legal team in Chicago, and her own operations here in the city. She needed all correspondence filtered and prioritized within 30 minutes of arrival, with a summary delivered verbally twice a day at times she would specify. She needed her medical schedule, physical therapy, specialist appointments, the medication schedule Mrs. Paulson currently managed, but which Victoria wanted consolidated, handled with complete discretion. She needed someone who could be available by phone between 6 in the morning and 10 at night, and occasionally later. She needed someone who understood that she worked through lunch, sometimes through dinner, and that her schedule was not a suggestion. None of this was the unreasonable part. Demanding, yes. Unreasonable, not technically. The unreasonable part revealed itself gradually over the course of the first morning, the way a storm revealed itself. Not all at once, but in accumulating pressure. He had been at the desk she assigned him for 40 minutes when she called across the room without looking up from her own screen. "I need the Hartman contract on my desk in the next 10 minutes. He pulled up the document management system she'd given him access to and searched. Nothing under Hartman. He searched variations of the spelling. Nothing. "I'm not finding it in the system," he said. "Could it be filed under a different name?" "It's in the system. You're not looking correctly." He kept looking. He looked for 8 of those 10 minutes and found nothing. "I've searched every variation I can think of. I don't see it. Is there another system or a physical file?" She looked up then. "You've had access to this system for 40 minutes. You clearly haven't learned it yet. This is a problem. If you can tell me where to look, I'll find it immediately. Part of this job is figuring things out without needing your hand held." He held her gaze. "I understand that. I'm also telling you that I've looked thoroughly and I can't find a document that may or may not exist under a name I don't have. I'm not asking you to hold my hand. I'm asking for a single piece of information so I can get you what you need." The silence lasted long enough to be deliberate. "Check the Morrison subfolder," she said finally. "The Hartman matter was filed under the client that referred them." He found it in 45 seconds. He printed it and brought it to her desk. She took it without looking at him. By 10 o'clock, he had fielded 3 phone calls she had declined to take herself and summarized them in the written format she had specified. He had rescheduled 2 appointments that conflicted with a therapy session that had been added to the calendar after the original appointments were set. He had handled a delivery that arrived at the side entrance and required a signature. He had also, in that time, been told that his font size in the summary document was wrong. It was in 11 point, and she used 12. That he was breathing too loudly near her workspace, which was a sentence he had never expected to hear in a professional setting, and that the way he'd answered the phone was not the greeting format she used, which she had not told him. He fixed the font. He moved his chair back 2 feet. He asked her, without comment, what the correct phone greeting was. She told him like he should have already known. Got it, he said, and used it correctly for every call after that. At 10:30, she asked him to research 3 commercial properties in the downtown district and have a comparison analysis on her desk by noon. A 2-hour task, reasonable enough. Except she also asked him at 11 to reschedule her entire afternoon calendar because a call with the London investors had been moved up, which required a chain of emails to 4 different parties. And at 11:20, she called him over to her desk and pointed at the stack of mail he'd sorted that morning. "You put the Walsh correspondence in the low priority category." "Yes. It was a courtesy copy of a legal filing, no action required. The Walsh matter is ongoing litigation. Anything from their attorneys is high priority, always." He'd had no way to know about the Walsh matter. There had been no briefing. He made a note of it, moved the letter, updated the priority system he'd been building in his head since 8 in the morning. She watched him do it without apology. He got the property analysis to her at 11:58. He knew because he checked. At noon, he went to the small kitchen adjacent to the office to eat the sandwich he'd packed. He stood at the counter because there was no table in that room, only a coffee station and a microwave and a refrigerator that hummed too loud, and he ate half the sandwich in 4 minutes because he knew she'd need something before the afternoon was done, and he wanted to be back at his desk. Mrs. Paulson came in while he was eating. She looked at him the way a person looked at someone they expected to see leaving and hadn't yet. "Still here," she said, not unkindly. "Still here." She poured herself a coffee. "The last one left at noon. The one before that left at 10. Said she threw a stapler at him, but I was here and she didn't. She did tell him he was structurally incompetent, though." Structurally incompetent. Her words. Mrs. Paulson looked into her mug. "She's not always like this, you know." Ethan finished the last of his sandwich, folded the plastic wrap carefully, threw it away. "I don't know what she was like before," he said. "I only know what she's like now. The accident changed her." "I'm sure it did." He filled his water bottle from the tap. "But I've met people who went through bad things and didn't spend their time trying to make other people feel small." Mrs. Paulson looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Relief, maybe, or recognition. "You might be right about that," she said. He went back to his desk. The afternoon was worse than the morning. It started with the investor call, which ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time, which meant everything else on the afternoon calendar was cascading, which meant Ethan spent 90 minutes managing a chain reaction of rescheduled calls and postponed meetings and a conference line that kept dropping the London participants for reasons he could not explain and could not fix. He spent 11 minutes on hold with the teleconferencing service. Victoria listened to that 11 minutes in visible silence, which was its own kind of pressure. When the call finally concluded, the right people finally on the line, the technical issues finally resolved through a workaround the service representative offered on minute 10. Victoria closed her laptop and looked at Ethan with the expression of someone tallying a score. "That was unacceptable," she said. "The service had a technical issue on their end. I documented the call number and got a credit authorization for the disruption. I don't need a credit. I need my calls to work." The teleconferencing platform had a regional outage that started at 2:15. I checked their status page. It affected multiple clients. I found a workaround in under 12 minutes. He kept his voice level. "If there's a backup conferencing solution you prefer, I'd like to know about it so I can use it next time." She stared at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Send me the summary by 4. He did. And he noticed, though he didn't say anything about it, that she read it immediately. At 4:30, she called him to her desk and handed him a list of items to pick up from 3 different locations before 6, when the last of them closed. He looked at the list and the timing and knew it was tight. He didn't say it was tight. He asked for the account numbers for the 2 items that required billing accounts, made sure he had all the addresses correct, and left. He made all 3 stops. I was back at her front door at 5:54. She was in the office when he returned, still at her desk, still working. She took the items and checked them against the list and set them down. Acceptable, she said. It was, he understood, the closest she was going to come to thank you. At 6:30, she told him he could go. He packed his bag, checked his desk was clear, made sure his task list for tomorrow was written out where he'd be able to find it. Mr. Brooks? He stopped, turned. She was looking at her screen, not at him. Her voice had lost some of its edge. Not much, not soft, but something. Like the last hour of effort had cost her something she didn't have reserves for. Tomorrow, 7:30. I'll be here at 7:15, he said. He left. He sat in his truck for a moment before he started it, not because he needed to, but because he wanted 60 seconds where no one needed anything from him. The rain had stopped at some point during the afternoon. The street was dark and wet, and the windows of the houses on this block were all lit from inside. Warm light, people doing normal things, dinner and television, and whatever else normal things looked like from the outside. He started the truck and drove to his mother's house to pick up Sophie. She was at the kitchen table with a book spread open and a bowl of cereal that was mostly milk at this point, and when he came through the door, she slid off the chair and crossed the kitchen in 3 running steps and hit him at the waist. He caught her. He always caught her. That was the whole of the job, really, catching her and making sure she didn't know how close things had gotten. How was it? His mother asked from the sink. Fine. She gave him a look. He gave her one back that meant not in front of Sophie. I made dinner, his mother said. It's in the oven. I can't stay. I've got to get her home, get her bathed, get her to bed. Ethan. I'm fine, Mom. That's not dinner. That's you carrying a plate of food through a drive-through window. He smiled in spite of himself. I love you. I know. She handed him the covered dish anyway. In the truck Sophie strapped in the back seat, he navigated home one-handed while she narrated her entire day. The thing that had happened at recess, the book she was reading, the fact that her teacher had brought in a dog, an actual dog, for some kind of lesson about responsibility, and Sophie had been chosen to hold the leash, and this was apparently the single greatest thing that had happened in her educational career to date. He listened. He asked questions. He laughed when she wanted him to laugh. He didn't tell her that he had $12 left in his checking account after the rent payment cleared. He didn't tell her that the job had been 11 hours of barely contained combat. He didn't tell her that he had no idea if he'd survive another day of it. She was 7. She needed to believe he had it figured out. He put her to bed at 8:30 with the lamp on low because she still didn't love the dark, and he sat at the kitchen table with what was left of his mother's dinner and went through the notes he'd made during the day. He built a proper map of Victoria Sterling's world, the calendar, the contacts, the filing logic, the quirks of the building's systems, the things that were left unsaid in the briefing and that he'd had to learn the hard way in real time. He wrote down the things she hadn't told him that he should have known. He wrote down the things he'd done wrong. He wrote down what he'd do differently. He went to bed at 11. His alarm was set for 5:45 Musam. The second day was different in the way a storm was different from the aftermath of a storm. The same destruction, but now you knew what you were dealing with. He arrived at 7:13. He knew, without any evidence, that she was already watching the clock. She was at her desk when he came in, already on a call, and she looked at him with the expression of someone checking a box. He went to his desk. He already had his task list. He started working before she finished her call. By 9, she had found 4 things to criticize. The coffee order he'd taken from Mrs. Paulson's notes and placed, wrong temperature, she preferred it at a specific degree he'd had no way of knowing. The formatting on a letter he'd drafted based on her spoken instructions. She used a 2-space indent, not the standard one. A meeting confirmation he'd sent on her behalf. She signed correspondence as V. Sterling, not Victoria Sterling. The quarterly report summary he'd prepared. She wanted bullet points, not paragraphs, despite the fact that she'd told him paragraphs when she briefed him. He fixed all 4 without comment. He updated his style guide. He asked her, on the last item, which she preferred going forward. Bullet points, she said. I thought that was obvious. You told me paragraphs yesterday morning. I said I prefer concise summaries. You said full paragraph format. The silence had a different quality to it this time. Not the silence of someone waiting for him to leave. Something more like being caught. Bullet points, she said again, with slightly less certainty. Noted, he said, and went back to his desk. At 10, she had a physical therapy appointment in the building. There was a room on the second floor with specialized equipment that he hadn't been inside yet. The therapist arrived at 10 sharp, a large, professionally unbothered man named Marcus, who had apparently been working with Victoria for several months, and had the practiced ease of someone who had found a way to do his job without requiring her approval. Ethan watched them in the hallway before the session started and saw something he hadn't expected. Marcus didn't talk to Victoria the way other people did. He didn't soften his words. He didn't flinch when she was sharp with him. He just answered in the same unhurried tone and waited for her to follow him into the room. That's the model, Ethan thought. The session lasted an hour. He used the time to reorganize her contact database, which had been structured by whoever had held this position before the last person who'd held this position, and which made approximately no logical sense. By the time Victoria reappeared, he had built a new index and cross-referenced it with the calendar entries. She looked at the updated system on his screen when she came to sign off on a letter. She didn't say anything about it, but she spent 45 seconds reading through it before she picked up the letter. By the end of the first week, he had survived something that had broken 11 other people. He wasn't sure survived was quite the right word. I was tired in a way that started behind his eyes and went all the way down. Every day was a careful navigation, staying professional when she was deliberately provoking, staying focused when she created problems just to watch him solve them, staying present when what he most wanted was 60 consecutive minutes of silence. But something else was happening too, something slower and less obvious. On Wednesday, she had asked him to source a specific medical reference book that her specialist had recommended, a text that was out of print and available through only 2 academic suppliers. He found it, ordered it, had it expedited. When it arrived. Thursday morning, she opened the package without acknowledging how he'd found it, but later that day, he caught her reading it at her desk during what should have been a break, turned to a chapter near the back, and she had a pen in her hand and was making marks in the margin, which was the kind of thing people only did with books they were serious about. On Thursday, she'd had a call that went badly. He didn't know the details. He'd stepped away at her instruction before it started. But when it ended, she was different for the rest of the afternoon. Not sharp, exactly. Sharp was normal. This was something else, something quieter and more dangerous, like the surface of water just before it froze. She sent him on an errand at 4 that kept him out of the building for 40 minutes, and when he came back, Mrs. Paulson was in the hallway outside the office with a look on her face. She threw out the files on the Morrison account, she said quietly. Just into the trash, the physical copies. He set down what he was carrying. Is anything missing that shouldn't be? I don't know. I didn't go through them. I'll take care of it. He went to the office recycling and carefully went through the stack. Most of it was duplicated in the digital system. 2 items weren't. He scanned them, filed them correctly, and put them back in the physical folder without mentioning it to her. He found out the next morning that the call Thursday had been from the law firm handling her fiancé's situation. Not her fiancé, her former fiancé, the one from the accident. Something about a property matter that was apparently still unresolved. He didn't learn the details. He learned them by piecing together a name on a letter that arrived Friday morning and the particular way she looked at the envelope before she set it aside. He filed it in high priority without comment. On Friday afternoon at 4:50, she said, without preamble. You can take Monday off. He looked up. Why? Because I'm telling you to. My schedule doesn't require a day off. She looked at him with an expression he had started to learn, not the one she used when she was annoyed, a different one, more considered. You've worked 11 days without a day off. That's not a question. I can count. I was hired for full-time, 7 days. I know what you were hired for. She turned back to her screen. Take the day. Come back Tuesday. He did. He spent the day with Sophie, who had recently developed an intense interest in caterpillars and had found 3 of them in the backyard that she was now tracking with a kind of scientific dedication he found genuinely impressive. They spent the morning in the yard with a mason jar and a library book about metamorphosis. In the afternoon, they went to the grocery store and Sophie picked out the ingredients for the macaroni and cheese she'd been wanting to make herself, which took twice as long as it should have and tasted, objectively, better than anything he'd had all week. He thought about Victoria Sterling exactly once during that day. He thought about her standing, Sitting, he corrected himself, sitting, alone in that large house over the weekend, and then he thought about how that wasn't his business and put it away. When he came back Tuesday, something had shifted. He couldn't put his finger on exactly what. She was still sharp, still demanding, still watching for mistakes, with the patience of someone running an endurance test. But there was something different in the texture of it, less like testing and more like waiting. Like she was waiting to see if the thing that had happened the first week would keep happening. He kept showing up, he kept working, he kept adapting. The schedule settled. Not easily, but it settled. He learned which battles were worth holding his ground on, and which ones were better resolved by simply adjusting. He learned which criticisms were genuine corrections, and which ones were noise. He learned that when she went silent before answering a direct question, it usually meant the question had hit something real. He also started learning things she didn't tell him. The therapy sessions were hard for her. He could tell by the way she moved the afternoon after each one, the slight restraint in her posture that she covered with efficiency, the way she pushed the afternoon calls harder than usual, as if to prove something. The specialist visits were harder. She came back from those with the blankest face she owned, which he had come to understand meant the news had been neither good nor bad, just complicated in ways she didn't have language for. He also learned that she worked best when left alone in the mornings. If he front-loaded interaction, she became irritable by 11. If he let her have the first 2 hours with minimal interruption and handled what he could independently, she was more functional the rest of the day. He didn't tell her he'd noticed this. He just adjusted his approach. One morning, in the third week, he came in to find her already on the phone, voice low, the kind of low that meant it was personal. He went to his desk quietly. He didn't try to interpret. He started on the day's tasks. When the call ended, she sat for a moment before she picked up her next document. He heard the quality of that silence the way you heard a held breath, and he kept his attention on his screen. My physical therapist thinks I could regain partial standing capability, she said. Not to him exactly, more like thinking out loud. He looked up. In what time frame? He said a year, maybe 18 months. A pause. If I commit fully to the program. Are you going to? She looked at him sharply. That's not your business. No, he agreed. It's not. She picked up her document. He went back to his screen. 5 minutes later, she said, He's been telling me that for 4 months and I've been arguing with the data. Ethan didn't say anything. I've been arguing with it because if you commit to a goal and you fail at it, that's worse than not trying. She said it like she was reading a fact off a page. Obviously. He set down what he was doing. He turned to look at her. Yeah, he said, I know. Something passed between them. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like recognition, the kind that happened when two people who had each been carrying something heavy were standing close enough to see it in each other. I told him yes, she said. Good, he said, and went back to work. He didn't make a thing of it. He didn't let it become a moment she would need to walk back later. He just received it and let it go, which was, he was beginning to understand, the only way to keep her talking. By the end of the month, one thing had become undeniable. Victoria Sterling was not who she appeared to be. Underneath the precision and the cruelty. And it was cruelty. He didn't sanitize it for himself. There was someone who read everything she could get her hands on, who had opinions about architecture and film and economic policy that were sharp and occasionally surprising, who had built a company from nothing in an industry that had tried to tell her she was too young and too female and too aggressive to be taken seriously. There was also someone who had a photograph on the windowsill of her office that she had never mentioned and that no one was supposed to see her looking at. He'd only noticed it because he'd been straightening a stack of reports near the window one afternoon and caught her gaze tracking to it before she caught herself. It was an older photograph. Informal. She was standing, in what looked like a backyard somewhere, her arm around someone he couldn't quite make out because the photo was turned slightly away. She was laughing in it, full, genuine, face-changing laughter. He didn't look at it again. He didn't need to, because it told him something he'd been slowly figuring out for weeks. The woman in his office was not the real Victoria Sterling. She was what was left of Victoria Sterling after the real one had been taken apart and not yet put back together. And somewhere in that calculus, in the months of impossible demands and morning silences and therapy appointments and the single photograph on the windowsill, Ethan Brooks had stopped thinking about the paycheck. Not because he didn't still need it. He did. He still needed it desperately, in the specific grinding way that people with $12 in a checking account and a 7-year-old who needed new school shoes needed a paycheck. but he'd started showing up every morning for a different reason, or at least an additional one. He just didn't have a name for it yet. The fifth week started the same way the first four had. Ethan at his desk by 7:15, coffee already made, the day's calendar reviewed and flagged before Victoria appeared. But something had changed in the architecture of their routine, in the way a path through a yard eventually becomes a trail, because enough people have walked it enough times. They both knew where the edges were now. They had both, without discussing it, stopped pretending otherwise. It didn't make her easier. She was still Victoria Sterling, which meant she was still capable of reducing a room to silence with 2 words, still capable of calling him over to correct something he'd done with the precision of someone who had been saving the observation for maximum impact. But the attacks had changed shape. In the first weeks they had been blunt, designed to break. Now they were sharper and more targeted, which he had come to understand was actually better. Targeted criticism had a reason behind it. It meant she was paying attention to the work, not just to whether she could make him leave. He had also learned that she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. Not with any warmth, not with whatever passed for fondness. More the way you watched an experiment you couldn't quite explain the results of. He didn't address it, he just worked. On a Wednesday in week 5, he came back from a lunch errand. She'd wanted a specific salad from a restaurant 12 blocks away that didn't deliver, and he'd learned quickly that the logistics of her preferences were non-negotiable. To find her in the middle of a phone call that was not going well. He could tell from the hallway. The quality of her voice had gone flat in a specific way, the professional flat that wasn't calm at all but was performing calm. And when he came through the door, she looked at him with an expression that said, "Stay without saying it." He set down the food, went to his desk, and kept his head down. When she ended the call, she sat for a moment with her phone face down on the desk. Then she said, without preamble, "My lead developer is threatening to quit." He looked up. "What happened?" "What always happens." She wheeled back from the desk slightly. It was a restless movement, the kind she used when she needed to be doing something physical that she couldn't do anymore. "He's been poached. Someone made him an offer and now he's using it as leverage." "Is it a real offer or a negotiation tactic? Does it matter?" "Yes," Ethan said. "If it's real, you're deciding how much he's worth to you versus what you'd pay to replace him plus the cost of transition time. If it's a tactic, you're deciding how much to give him and what precedent that sets with the rest of the team." She looked at him. "You've done this before." "I managed a property maintenance crew for 3 years. Half the job was figuring out which guys were actually going to walk and which ones just needed to feel like they could. This isn't a maintenance crew." "The psychology is the same." He paused. "What's he asking for?" She told him. He thought about it. "Is he worth it at that number?" "He's irreplaceable at that number." "Then give him what he wants and make him feel like you fought for it." She turned that over. "I've already told him the budget is fixed." "So you told him something that wasn't true." "I told him the current budget is fixed. He knows the difference." Ethan turned back to his screen. "Call him back and tell him you spoke to your board and you found a way. Don't make it easy. Let him know you went to bat for him. That part matters as much as the number." The silence that followed was longer than usual. "Where did you learn to negotiate?" "By losing money until I figured out how not to." She picked up her phone. She made the call. He didn't listen. He put his focus on the quarterly filing he was working through. But 40 minutes later, she reappeared in the main office and sat down at her desk and said, to no one in particular, "He's staying." Ethan didn't say, "I told you." He said, "Good." She looked at him with that look again, the experiment look. And then she picked up her work. They didn't discuss it again. But something had moved, subtly and irreversibly, like the first inch of ice thawing at the edge of a lake. Not enough to step on, not enough to call progress, but real. The physical therapy intensified that month. Marcus was coming 3 times a week instead of 2, and the sessions were longer, and Victoria came out of them differently than before. Not happier. That wasn't the right word. More charged, maybe. The way a person looked after something hard had happened, but they'd made it through to the other side. There was something in it that read almost like defiance. She had told him, in that oblique way she communicated anything personal, that she'd agreed to the full program. She was doing it, and Ethan, who had made a career of reading people who didn't say what they meant, understood that this was one of the most costly decisions she had made in a long time. One afternoon, near the end of week 6, he passed the therapy room on his way to check the second-floor printer that had been jammed since morning. The door was slightly open. He didn't slow down. He was 2 steps past it when he heard her voice, low and strained and nothing like her office voice. I did it. Don't make a thing of it. He heard Marcus's reply, unhurried. I'm not making a thing of it. I'm writing it down because it's what I do. Write it down faster, then. A short silence. You stood for 8 seconds. A longer silence. Go again, Victoria said. Ethan kept walking. He didn't tell her he'd heard. He didn't bring it up. But that evening, when he was organizing the end-of-day briefing, he set the summary notes beside her desk instead of leaving them in the usual spot, close enough that she wouldn't have to reach. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that could be ignored. She didn't ignore it. She looked at the placement, then at him, with an expression he had learned meant she'd noticed without knowing whether to be bothered by it. She didn't say anything. But the next morning, the summary was on her desk with a single margin note in red pen, font still wrong. 11 point instead of 12. He had written the summary in a hurry. He fixed it, and accepted privately that this was her version of I noticed. The first time she really talked to him, not briefed, not instructed, not corrected, was a Thursday night in the 7th week when the building's heating system failed somewhere between 9 and 10, and the temperature dropped fast enough that by 10:30, neither of them could reasonably pretend it wasn't cold. He'd called the building maintenance company at 9:50 when he first noticed the change in the air. They told him a technician could be there in 3 hours. He told them that wasn't acceptable. They told him that was the earliest available window. He asked for a supervisor, worked through 2 transfers, and eventually got a call back that pushed it to 2 hours. He reported this to Victoria. 2 hours, she said. I can source a portable heater. There's a hardware store 6 blocks east that's open until 11. You can't leave. I need you here until the call's clear. He looked at the last 2 calls on the schedule. I can push the 9:15 to tomorrow morning and combine it with the 10 o'clock. That gets both parties on the same call and frees your evening. She considered it. Fine. I can be back in 20 minutes. Go. He went. He came back in 18 with 2 portable heaters, one for her office and one for the space outside it where he worked. He set them up and watched the room temperature stop dropping. She was still at her desk when he finished, and something about the scene, the late hour, the makeshift warmth, the strangeness of the situation, had apparently shifted the usual register of things, because when he sat back down, she said, out of nowhere, I used to hate the cold. He looked up. Before, she clarified. I used to hate it. I'd complain about it constantly, which the people around me found irritating. A small pause. Now I barely notice it until it's already this far gone. The nerve damage affects temperature sensitivity? She looked at him. You did your homework. I read what seemed relevant. He kept his voice even. You don't have to explain the medical details. I wasn't going to. She turned back to her screen. I was going to say that there are things you lose, and then there are things you lose that you don't realize until something small happens. And you think, oh, that's gone too. He didn't say anything right away. He thought about Sophie going through a phase at 5 where she'd refused to eat anything orange, and how when it stopped he'd only noticed because he'd bought sweet potatoes out of habit and she'd eaten them without complaint. And something about that had made him unexpectedly sad. Yeah, he said. I know what that's like. It's not the same. No, he agreed. It's not. She seemed slightly wrong-footed by that. By the agreement, maybe. By him not arguing for equivalence. What did you lose? She asked. And then, almost immediately, you don't have to answer that. My wife, he said. 3 years ago. She had a heart condition we didn't know about. He kept his voice matter-of-fact the way you kept your voice matter-of-fact about things you had cried about, alone in enough parking lots. Sophie was 4. I was 39 days into a new job. I had to go back to work on day 8 because we didn't have enough in savings to cover the rent. The silence was different this time. Victoria Sterling, who was rarely at a loss, said nothing. What I lost that I didn't notice until later, he said, was the ability to be surprised by good things. Like it took a long time before something good could happen, and I could just let it be good, without immediately thinking about when it would end. She was looking at him now, not the experiment look, something more direct. Did it come back? He thought about it honestly. Mostly. Sophie helped. She doesn't know how to be cautious about good things yet. She gets excited about caterpillars. He almost smiled. It's hard to stay guarded when someone near you has absolutely no defenses. Victoria looked away. She looked at something in the middle distance that wasn't the screen or the desk. I don't remember how to do that. I know. I'm not asking for advice. I know that too, he said, and left it there. She worked until 11 that night. He stayed until she sent him home. Neither of them mentioned the conversation again, but it had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and that was its own kind of change. The 8th week brought the first real crisis. It started on a Monday morning when an email arrived from Victoria's board of directors, specifically from a board member named Gerald Hayworth, whom Ethan had come to understand was the kind of man who had the title of advisor, but operated like he had the authority of an owner. The email was flagged urgent. Ethan read the subject line, read the first 2 sentences, and took it directly to Victoria before her first call. She read it. Her face did the thing it did when something had hit below the usual waterline. Very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm. When did this come in? 6:42 this morning. Has anyone else on the executive team received a copy? I can't see their inboxes. But it was sent to your address only, which suggests he wanted to tell you before he told anyone else. She read it again. Ethan had read it twice already. The short version was that Hayworth had been speaking to 2 of the other board members about restructuring the leadership model in light of ongoing operational concerns, language that meant, in translation, that there were people on the board who thought Victoria shouldn't be running her own company anymore. The email was framed carefully, considerately, in the way a knife could be carefully and considerately placed between someone's ribs. He's been building this for months, she said. It wasn't a question. The Walsh litigation, the delayed Q3 reporting, the developer situation last week, he's been cataloging. Do you have existing documentation on the board meetings where these items were discussed? Some, not all. I need all of it. Every meeting note, every email chain, every decision log that touches any item Hayworth mentioned. He pulled up the document management system. And I need your read on who on the board is genuinely with him versus who he's using as a number. She gave him a long look. You're moving fast. You have 4 days before the next board call. If he's building a case, the way to answer it isn't to respond to his narrative. It's to show up with a better one. He kept his voice level. I can build the briefing document, but I need to know what we're working with first. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Marcus Chen and Diane Park are with me unconditionally. Hayworth has Warren and probably Simmons. Ewan is undecided. Then Ewan is the conversation you need to have before Thursday. I know that. Do you have a relationship with her outside of board meetings? We've met twice. She respects direct communication. Call her today, not about the board situation. Call her about the Q4 expansion proposal. Get her on record caring about growth before the question of leadership comes up. Victoria stared at him. You've done this before too. No, but I've watched people lose jobs they should have kept because they reacted instead of maneuvered. I'm not going to let that happen to you. The words landed somewhere neither of them had expected. He saw it in the slight change in her expression. Not the experiment look. Not the flat professional mask. Something more like being seen and not knowing what to do with it. I'll call you in, she said. They spent the next 3 days building the presentation package together. It was the most they had worked in direct proximity for an extended period, her desk pulled to where she could see his screen, annotating as he drafted, correcting his framing when she had sharper language, which was often. He learned things about her company in those 3 days that he hadn't understood from the outside, the architecture of it, the decisions she'd made and why, the places where she'd taken risks that had paid off, and the places where they hadn't, and what she'd done about both. She was, when you got past everything else, exceptional at this. He told her that once, during the second night when it was past 10 and the document was nearly done, and they'd been going for 6 hours, and the empty coffee cups had accumulated on the edge of the desk. You built something real, he said. Whatever Hayworth says about operational concerns, you built something that didn't exist before, and it works. She didn't respond right away. You sound like a press release. I sound like someone who's read 4 years of your financials in the last 72 hours. A pause. The Q2 of year 2 almost killed it. I know. You restructured the supplier agreements and recovered in 8 weeks. 11 weeks. The documents say 8. The documents are politely inaccurate. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. It was the first physically tired gesture he'd seen from her. It took 11 weeks and I fired 3 people who didn't deserve it, and I have never fully resolved that. He looked at her. I was scared, she said. And I made decisions while I was scared, and some of them were wrong. She said it like a statement of fact, clinical. Hayworth knows about those decisions. That's what he's going to use. So we address it first. You acknowledge the missteps, show what you learned from them, show what changed. Taking the narrative away from him is better than letting him define it. She was quiet again. You don't have to be perfect, he said. You just have to be credible. She looked at him, really looked at him. Why are you working this hard on this? He thought about the honest answer. The honest answer had several layers, and he peeled back to the most straightforward one. Because you built something worth protecting. And because if Hayworth wins this, you lose more than the job title. She turned back to the screen. Go home, Ethan. Get some sleep. He noticed she had used his name. First time without the formality of Mr. Brooks. He went home. He lay awake in the dark for a while, not thinking about the board presentation, which was done and good. Thinking about the look on her face when he'd said you built something real. Not gratitude. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud. He fell asleep before he could do anything useful with the thought. The board call on Thursday ran 2 hours. Ethan wasn't on it. He sat at his desk outside the office with the door closed and handled the day's correspondence with a level of focus that was approximately 60% genuine. When the call ended, the door stayed closed for another 10 minutes. When she came out, her face was very composed and her eyes were slightly too bright, the way eyes got when you had been holding something in for 2 hours. Ewan voted with us, she said. I know, she would. Hayworth tabled the restructuring proposal. He'll bring it back. Yes, but not right away. No. She went to her desk. She sat down. She looked at the calendar already loaded on her screen. I want the Q4 expansion documentation finalized and circulated to the full board by end of next week. Done. She started typing. He went back to his desk. The morning continued. The phone rang and he answered it in the correct format she had specified, 2 months ago now, the one he'd learned on the first day after the call she hadn't told him about. At noon, Mrs. Paulson appeared in the hallway with 2 plates. She asked me to make lunch, she said, in a tone of such elaborate casualness that it was clearly covering something. Ethan looked at the plates. 2 of them. Both for her? He said. Mrs. Paulson gave him a look that communicated a wealth of information in a very short time, then set 1 plate on his desk and carried the other into the office. He ate it. It was good. He didn't make anything of it, the way he made nothing of most things when it came to Victoria Sterling, the way he had learned, slowly and through sustained effort, was the only way to keep her talking. He was almost certain she knew he'd noticed. The lunch plates became a quiet habit after that, unremarked upon by either of them, which was the only way it could survive. Mrs. Paulson brought 2 plates at noon on the days Ethan was in the building, and Ethan ate at his desk, and Victoria ate at hers, and they worked through it, and nobody said anything about what it meant because naming it would have required Victoria to either defend it or dismantle it, and she had chosen, for reasons of her own, to do neither. Ethan understood this. He understood it the way he'd come to understand most things about her, not through what she said, but through the architecture of what she didn't. The week settled into something that wasn't quite comfortable but had stopped being war. She was still demanding. She still corrected him with a precision that could strip the paint off a wall. She still created the occasional impossible situation, less often now and with less conviction, like a habit she hadn't fully broken. But there were also the mornings where she handed him her coffee cup without asking, and he refilled it without comment. And the afternoons where she talked through a business problem out loud. Not because she needed his input, but because she needed to hear it said, and he had learned to be the kind of presence that made that possible. Responsive, but undemanding, available without hovering. He had also, without planning to, become the person who knew more about her daily reality than anyone else in her life. He knew which medications she took and when, because he managed the schedule. He knew which physical therapy exercises she was working on, because he heard Marcus giving instructions through the closed door and had learned to read the post-session signs. He knew that she called her mother on the first Sunday of every month for exactly 20 minutes, and that the calls always left her in a mood that took the rest of the afternoon to metabolize. He knew that she kept the photograph on the windowsill turned at a specific angle, not away from the room entirely, but not facing it either, halfway, like she couldn't decide. He had never asked about the photograph. He had never asked about the man in it. He suspected she was waiting for him to, and that there would have been a particular satisfaction in shutting that door on him. So he never opened it. Sophie changed everything without trying. It was a Friday in early November, the kind of day that looked like autumn and felt like winter, with a gray sky that hadn't decided yet whether to rain or just threaten. Ethan had been at the building since 7:15 as usual. What was not usual was that Sophie's school had called at 8:40 to inform him that the furnace had failed overnight and the building was too cold to operate, and students were being sent home. His mother was at a doctor's appointment. The backup arrangements he had carefully prepared for this kind of emergency had been constructed around illnesses and school holidays, not sudden same-day closures. He worked through the options in his head in approximately 4 minutes while managing Victoria's 9 o'clock calendar prep, and the options were leave and find coverage or bring Sophie here. He didn't want to do either. He brought Sophie. He told Victoria before he did it. That was non-negotiable. He would not walk a 7-year-old into her home without warning. He knocked on the office door at 9:12 and said, "I have a situation. My daughter's school closed this morning. I need to either leave for 2 hours to find coverage or work with her here for the day. Neither is ideal. I'm telling you so you can decide which is less disruptive." Victoria looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "How old is she?" 7. "Can she stay quiet?" "For reasonable stretches. She has books, and she can draw. She won't bother you." A pause. Something shifted behind her eyes, something that wasn't quite discomfort but wasn't far from it. "Bring her in." He brought her in. Sophie walked through the front door of Victoria Sterling's building the way 7-year-olds walked into places. With complete attention, head moving, taking inventory of everything without self-consciousness. She looked at the foyer, at the staircase, at the hallway. She looked at Mrs. Paulson, who had appeared from somewhere and was smiling at her in the way adults smiled at children when they were genuinely pleased by them. "It's really big," Sophie said. "It is," Ethan agreed. "Does someone actually live here?" "Yes." "Just one person?" "Sophie." "I'm just asking." He set her up in the small sitting room off the main hallway with her backpack, her books, the travel art kit she never went anywhere without, and instructions to stay in that room unless she needed the bathroom, in which case she should tell Mrs. Paulson, who was down the hall. Sophie accepted these instructions with the focused nod of someone agreeing to terms. Ethan went back to the office. For 40 minutes, everything was fine. He could hear Sophie in the sitting room, not loudly, just the ambient sounds of a child occupied, the slight scratch of colored pencils, the occasional soft sound of a page turning. It was, if he was being honest with himself, not unpleasant. The building had always had a silence that was more like absence than peace. This was different. Victoria heard it too. He could tell by the way she paused once, in the middle of reviewing a document, head slightly tilted, listening. She didn't say anything. At 10:20, Sophie appeared in the doorway of the office. She had a drawing in her hand. She looked at Victoria with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a child who had not yet learned to find wheelchairs remarkable, and she said, "I drew the hallway, but I got the floor pattern wrong. Do you know what color it actually is?" Victoria looked at her. Ethan was already out of his chair. "Sophie, I said stay in. I just had a question. You can ask me, not Ms. Sterling." Sophie looked at Victoria, then at Ethan, then back at Victoria with the expression of someone conducting a private assessment. "You look like you've seen my drawing before," she said to Victoria. "Is it because it's bad?" "It's not bad," Victoria said. Her voice was its usual precise self, but something in the edges of it had changed, a slight uncertainty, like she was using a tool she hadn't picked up in a long time. "The floor is dark gray, almost black." Sophie looked at her drawing. "I only have regular gray." She held it up toward the window to look at it in better light. "That'll have to be close enough." "Sophie." Ethan moved toward the door. "Is it okay if I ask one more thing?" Victoria said, "What?" At the same time, Ethan said, "No." Sophie asked Victoria, "Why do you have a wheelchair?" Sophie, "But I had an accident," Victoria said. "Like falling off a bike?" "Like a car accident." Sophie processed this with a child's unadorned seriousness. "My dad's friend Kevin had a car accident. He hurt his shoulder. Is your whole body hurt?" "Just part of it." "Which part?" "Sophie, that's enough." Ethan had reached the doorway. He looked at Victoria with an apology already forming, and she did something that stopped him. She shook her head. Barely. One small movement. Not to him. To the apology. "My legs," Victoria said to Sophie. "I can't feel them or move them the same way anymore." Sophie looked at the wheelchair. She looked at Victoria's legs. She looked up at Victoria's face with the same attention she'd given the drawing a moment ago. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes, when I'm working on getting better." "Oh." Sophie seemed to find this sufficient. She looked at her drawing again. "Is it okay if I draw in the hallway? The floor pattern is more interesting there." You can draw wherever you want, Victoria said. Ethan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. Sophie disappeared back into the hallway. They heard her settle on the floor, not in the sitting room, somewhere closer, just outside the office. The sound of pencils started again. Ethan went back to his desk. He could feel Victoria not looking at him in the specific way she didn't look at him, when something had gotten past her defenses and she needed a moment to rebuild them. He let her have the moment. By 11:30, Sophie had migrated, in the incremental way children migrated, from the hallway to just inside the office doorway, then, when no one sent her back, to a spot near the window that had good light and was close enough that she could see both her drawing and the room. She worked in silence. She was, when absorbed in something, a surprisingly quiet child. And Victoria worked at her desk, and Ethan worked at his, and the room contained all three of them in a way that should have been strange, but was not. At noon, Mrs. Paulson appeared with 3 plates. Ethan noticed the number and kept his face neutral. Sophie noticed immediately. "Is one of those for me?" "Yes," Mrs. Paulson said, in a tone that suggested she had been waiting to have a child in this house for quite some time. "What is it?" "Grilled cheese and tomato soup." Sophie's face went through a sequence of expressions that concluded in undisguised joy. "That's my favorite." "I know." Mrs. Paulson set the plate down beside Sophie's drawing supplies with the practiced ease of someone who had been watching all morning and planning accordingly. Ethan looked at his own plate. The same. He looked toward the office. Victoria was eating at her desk. She had a fork, and she was reading a document. She did not look up. He ate his lunch. After lunch, Sophie brought her drawing to Victoria's desk. This time, Ethan didn't move to stop her, partly because he could see it coming, and partly because he had begun to understand that stopping it might be the wrong call. "I finished it," Sophie said. She set it on the edge of Victoria's desk, carefully, not on any papers. "It's the front hallway. The gray isn't quite right, but I think it's close." Victoria looked at the drawing. She looked at it for longer than Ethan expected. The drawing was, objectively, good for a 7-year-old. The proportions weren't right, but the attention to the details was. The floor pattern, the staircase banister, a window at the far end with light coming through it. "You put light in the window," Victoria said. "It was coming in when I was drawing it." Sophie leaned on the desk edge with both elbows, looking at the drawing alongside Victoria. "I don't know how to draw light right yet. It looks kind of blobby." "It looks like light," Victoria said. Sophie considered this. "You can keep it if you want." Victoria looked at her. "I draw a lot," Sophie said. "I don't have room for all of them. Dad makes me throw some away, but this one turned out okay, so I want it to go somewhere good." The silence that followed was brief and total. "All right," Victoria said. Sophie nodded like a deal had been closed, pushed off the desk, and went back to her window spot. Ethan kept his eyes on his screen. I was aware that his chest felt odd, something tight and warm that he could not have described adequately, and chose not to examine. Victoria set the drawing on the corner of her desk, not on top of any papers, propped slightly against the wall. She went back to reading. She kept it there for the rest of the day. At 3 in the afternoon, Sophie fell asleep in the reading chair near the window. The deep, unglamorous sleep of a tired child, head tipped sideways, one arm hanging off the edge. Ethan covered her with his jacket. Victoria watched him do it from across the room. "She trusts you," Victoria said, quiet enough that it wasn't going to wake Sophie. "She's 7. She trusts everyone." "She trusts you specifically," Victoria said, "the way she checked where you were when she was asking me questions. That's not general trust. That's knowing who your anchor is." He looked at Sophie, at the drawing on Victoria's desk, back at Sophie. "Her mom died when she was 4, he said. "She doesn't remember it the way I do, but her body remembers it, I think. She tracks me." Victoria said nothing. "It makes her brave about other things," he said, "because she's already handled the worst thing. She doesn't know that's why, but that's why." The room was quiet except for the soft sound of Sophie breathing. "She's not afraid of me," Victoria said. It came out less like an observation and more like something she was still determining the weight of. "No. Most people are. Sophie doesn't read body language the way adults do yet. She reads intent." He paused. "And your intent isn't what you want people to think it is." She looked at him. The look was not the experiment look, not the flat professional mask. This one was more unguarded than anything he'd seen from her, and he had a feeling it was not intentional, that it had slipped through while she was watching his daughter sleep. "Don't," she said, not sharp, just quiet. The tone of someone asking for a boundary, not enforcing one. Okay, he said, and looked back at his work. Sophie slept for 40 minutes. When she woke up, she was briefly confused, the way children were when they'd fallen asleep somewhere unexpected, looking around the room until she found Ethan, and then her face settled. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. Good nap? I wasn't trying to nap. I know. She looked at Victoria. Sorry if I snored. You didn't snore, Victoria said. Dad says I snore. I've never said that, Ethan said. You made the snoring face when you told Grandma about it. I don't have a snoring face. Sophie looked at Victoria with the expression of a child asking a neutral third party to adjudicate. He definitely has a snoring face. Victoria's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was smaller and more involuntary than that, the kind of expression the face made before the person had decided whether to allow it. It was gone in under 2 seconds. But it had been there. Ethan saw it. He looked back at his screen and didn't say a word. That evening he drove home with Sophie in the back seat, mid-narration about something that had happened with the art supplies. And he listened to her the way he always listened, but he was also somewhere else, turning something over in his mind that he couldn't yet put a shape to. The image that kept surfacing was not dramatic. It was just Victoria looking at the drawing, looking at it like someone who had been handed something they hadn't known they were still capable of wanting. He told himself it didn't mean what his instincts were suggesting it meant. He had a job and a daughter and a bank account that was currently solvent by a margin that still made him nervous. And Victoria Sterling was his employer and a woman working through a kind of grief that had its own timetable and was not his to rush. He told himself all of that. He believed most of it. The news about Daniel Rowe came on a Tuesday. Ethan didn't know the name at first. He saw it in an email that came through the general inbox at 10 in the morning. A forward from a mutual acquaintance. The kind of social forwarding that happened sometimes through the professional email when people didn't have a personal address. He almost flagged it as low priority. Something made him read the subject line twice. Congratulations to Daniel and Simone. Engaged. He put it in the standard social correspondence folder and didn't look at it again. He had no reason to know who Daniel Rowe was. He filed it and moved on. He found out who Daniel Rowe was at 11:15 when Victoria called him to her desk for the morning briefing, and he watched her open her inbox and reach that email and go completely, absolutely still. It was a different still from the board crisis. The board crisis had activated her. This stillness was the opposite, the kind that happened when something hit a place that had no defenses because it had stopped expecting to need them. She closed the email. She opened it again. She read it a second time. Ethan said nothing. He stood at the edge of her desk with the briefing notes and said nothing. She closed it again. Continue, she said. Her voice was the same. That was the thing that made it worse somehow. The completeness of the performance. The way she picked up the briefing and engaged with the first item with the same precision she always brought, asking the right questions, noting the right things. Only someone who had been paying attention for 3 months would have caught it. The way she was sitting with her weight slightly forward, the way she turned the pen in her hand 3 times before writing anything, the way she read the same line in the legal summary twice. He got through the briefing. She sent him back to his desk. By noon she had cleared her visible email and was on a call that she took with the door closed, which was usual. By 2 she was reviewing the Q4 documents he'd sent her revisions on, red pen moving. By 4 she had caught 2 errors in a supplier contract that her legal team had missed, and had sent them back with comments that were sharp enough to have come from any functional day. And yet, at 4:30 she said, "Can you reschedule the Friday afternoon calls to next week? All of them?" "Yes." "Do you want me to give a reason?" Schedule conflict. He rescheduled them without comment. He was aware with the specific awareness of someone who had learned to track the weather of her moods, that this was not a logistical decision. She was clearing the day. She was going to need the day. At 5 she told him to go home. He went. He stood outside for a moment in the November cold, looking at the windows of the building, and thought about Daniel Rowe, whoever he was, who had become engaged to someone named Simone and sent the news through a forwarded email that had landed in an inbox like a grenade with a 3-hour delay. He thought about the photograph on the windowsill, the angle it was kept at. Halfway. He went home. He made dinner. He helped Sophie with a school project about the water cycle that involved, for reasons he did not fully follow, significant amounts of blue construction paper. He put her to bed. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink and stared at nothing for a while. He thought about calling to check on Victoria. He decided against it. She hadn't asked for that. She didn't ask for things, which was its own kind of problem, but it was hers to manage. He went to bed. He came in the next morning to find that she had worked through the night. He could tell because the coffee station had been used, 2 cups worth, and the legal documents she'd had him file at 5 the previous day were back on her desk with comprehensive margin notes in different colored pens, which meant she'd worked through them twice. She was already at her desk when he arrived, in the same clothes, her hair less controlled than usual, and she looked at him when he came in with eyes that had the flat, exhausted quality of someone who had been awake too long. He didn't say anything about any of it. He made coffee. He brought her a cup. He sat down and started the day. At 9, she said, "The email yesterday, the row forwarding." "Yes." "Delete it from the inbox archive." "Done." She went back to her screen. He deleted the email. At 10, she said, "He was my fiancé before the accident." Ethan kept his eyes on his screen. "We were engaged for 8 months. The accident happened in March. He ended the engagement in July." Her voice was the reading from a page voice, factual, stripped. "He said he couldn't handle it. That was the word he used. Handle." Ethan said nothing. "I told him I understood, which I didn't, but I said it because it was easier than saying what I actually thought, which was—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what I actually thought." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the window. The photograph was in its usual position, angled halfway. "You kept his picture," Ethan said. "Not an accusation. Not even a question, quite." "I kept what I looked like in it," she said. "Before." That landed with a weight he hadn't anticipated. "Victoria." "Don't he?" "You look like you in it. Before and now are the same person." "They're not." She said it simply and with total conviction. The woman in that photograph could walk into a room and, "It doesn't matter. That's not self-pity. It's just accurate." "It's not accurate," he said. "It's the story you've been telling yourself long enough that it feels accurate." She looked at him sharply. "You don't know what— I know that your developer stayed because of how you handled that conversation. I know Yuan voted with you because you made her feel like the future of this company mattered. I know that the Walsh litigation is moving in your favor because of the brief you wrote at 2 in the morning last month." He paused. "None of that has anything to do with your legs. You're very sure of things you haven't lived." "You're right, I haven't lived it." He held her gaze. "But I've watched you. Every day for 3 months. And what I see is someone who has decided the accident took more than it actually did. Because it's easier to blame the wheelchair than to look at what's actually keeping you alone." The silence that followed was the longest of his time in this building. Her face went through something complex and rapid. Anger first, defensive and real, and then something under it that was worse than anger. The kind of expression a person had when a true thing was said out loud that they'd been successfully avoiding for a long time. "Get out of my office," she said. "Victoria, I said get out." Not loud, not cruel, just final. He got up. He went to his desk. He gathered what he needed for the day and moved to work from the hallway, because staying in the same room felt wrong when she'd asked him to leave it. Even technically, he hadn't left the building. He was there for 40 minutes when Mrs. Paulson appeared with a look on her face that had several layers. "She's asking for the briefing notes," Mrs. Paulson said. Ethan looked down the hallway. "Tell her I'll bring them in." He brought them. He set them on the edge of her desk. She didn't look up. 2:45 is moved, she said. "The client's pushed." "I saw. I rescheduled it to Thursday." "Good." He turned to go. "Ethan." He stopped. She still didn't look up. She had the briefing in front of her and her pen in her hand, and she looked from the outside entirely composed, but her hand was not moving. "I heard you," she said. He waited. "I didn't say you were right." "I know. But I heard you." He left her to her work. He went back to his desk, and the day continued the way days did, phone calls and documents, and the small logistical machinery of keeping a person's professional life running. But something had broken open in that room, something that had been sealed for a long time, and even Victoria Sterling, who was exceptional at maintaining surfaces, could not put that particular thing back the way it had been. The photograph stayed on the windowsill, but that evening, when he was leaving, he looked toward it out of habit. She had turned it to face the wall. The photograph stayed facing the wall. Ethan noticed and said nothing, and that silence between them carried its own weight. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present. Like the air after a storm had moved through. The storm had come and gone, and now both of them were standing in what it left behind, looking at what was still standing. The week after the Daniel Rowe conversation was careful. They were careful with each other in a way they hadn't been before, which was new because the previous 3 months had not been careful. They had been adversarial, then functional, then something harder to name. But this was different. This was two people who had both said more than they'd intended and were now navigating the afterward. Victoria didn't apologize. He didn't expect her to. She came in Monday morning with her usual precision and her usual list of corrections and her usual way of occupying a room like she was daring it to push back, and Ethan sat at his desk and matched her pace, and the day went the way days went. But in the afternoon, she asked him something she had never asked before. "How was your weekend?" He looked up. She was reading a contract. She did not look up. "Good," he said. "Sophie found a chrysalis in the backyard. We've been monitoring it." A pause. "What kind?" "Monarch, we think. She's been researching it." Victoria turned a page. "Monarchs take 8 to 15 days. "I know. She made a chart." "Of course she did." Victoria's pen moved. "Make sure you tell me when it hatches. She'll want to document it." He didn't point out the assumption in that sentence. The casual, "you'll tell me," as if Sophie's caterpillar was a shared concern, as if the lives outside this building had become, without anyone deciding it, part of the information that moved between them. He just said, "Yeah, I will," and went back to his work. The therapy sessions changed that month. Changed visibly, which was saying something because Marcus was not a man who changed his expression to reflect progress or setbacks. He had the professional neutrality of someone who understood that his patients needed him to be a fixed point, but even Marcus was different now. Less resistant energy coming out of the sessions. Victoria emerged from them not depleted the way she used to, but coiled, a kind of hard focus that she carried into the afternoon and turned on her work like it owed her something. Ethan watched it without commenting, but one afternoon Marcus stopped him in the hallway before he left. "She's been doing the full program," Marcus said. "All of it. Not just the sessions, the at-home work, the additional exercises, all of it." "I know. I updated her morning schedule to include time for it." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "She told me someone told her the wall she built was the real problem, not the chair." Ethan kept his face neutral. "She didn't say who," Marcus said, "but it shifted something. Whatever you said, it was the right thing at the right time." He paused. "Just so you know." Ethan nodded once. "How realistic is the standing prognosis?" "Realistic. Not certain. There's a difference." Marcus pulled on his coat. "She knows that. She's working toward it anyway." He looked briefly like he was going to say something more, then changed his mind. "See you Thursday." He left. Ethan stood in the hallway for a moment, working toward it anyway. He recognized that as the particular kind of courage that didn't announce itself, the kind that got up and did the work. Not because it was confident of the outcome, but because the alternative was accepting the walls. He recognized it because he'd been living inside a version of it for 3 years. December came in cold and stayed that way. Sophie's chrysalis hatched on a Wednesday morning. Ethan got the text from his mother at 8:43, a photo of Sophie crouched in the backyard with her face 3 inches from a plant, watching what he could just barely make out in the image as a monarch butterfly in the process of opening its wings. Sophie had drawn a small picture of it in her notebook first, documenting before it flew, which was so entirely Sophie that he had to set his phone face down for a moment before he could look at it again, without getting emotional in a room he was currently supposed to be professional in. He told Victoria at 9. He showed her the photo. She looked at it for a long moment. "Tell her I want a copy of the drawing," she said. "I'll tell her." "She doesn't have to, but if she wants to." Sophie wanted to. She made 2 copies, one she colored, one she left in pencil, and Ethan brought both in on Friday. Victoria kept the pencil one. She put it on the window sill beside where the photograph used to face outward, and Ethan registered the geography of that without comment. The board situation resurfaced in December. Hayworth had been quiet for 6 weeks, which Victoria had read correctly as strategic patience rather than retreat, and the second attempt came not through direct challenge, but through a proposed committee structure that would, if ratified, require executive decisions above a certain financial threshold to receive committee approval before implementation. It was elegant, as power grabs went. It didn't remove Victoria. It just installed a ceiling above her. They were in the office at 7:30 in the morning when it arrived, forwarded from the board secretary with a note that ratification was scheduled for the January meeting. Victoria read it at her desk. Ethan read it at his. Neither of them spoke for almost 3 minutes. He learned from the last time, Ethan said. He's been waiting for me to get comfortable, Victoria said. He thinks the UN situation made me overconfident. Did it? No. She set down the document. But I've been focused on the Q4 execution and the therapy program, and he's been working the board. I let that happen. You've been running a company. I've been running half a company, and he's been running the board. She looked at the document again. The threshold he's proposing, it's calibrated. It sounds reasonable to anyone who doesn't understand which decisions it actually affects. It affects your supplier agreements and any acquisition moves, which are the two areas where I've outperformed his projections by the widest margins. She said it without satisfaction. He's not trying to correct underperformance. He's trying to capture the value of overperformance. Then we explain that to the board. Marcus Chen will understand it. Diane Park will understand it once it's explained. Ewan trusts you more than she did in October, Ethan said. You need to get to her before Hayworth does. He's already gotten to her. Then get to her again. Victoria looked at him. You're very confident about board dynamics for someone who's never been in a boardroom. I've never been in a boardroom, he agreed. I've been in a lot of rooms where people were trying to take something from someone who built it. The tactics are the same. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, she didn't do that easily, but something in the direction of it. What's your read on Warren? Ethan thought about it. He'd been managing Victoria's communications long enough to have a feel for the board members through the texture of their correspondence. Warren follows Hayworth, but he's not committed. He voted with him last time because he thought that was where the weight was shifting. If you can shift the weight clearly in your favor before the January meeting, he moves with it. That gives me 4 weeks. 5. The meeting is January 17th. She picked up her pen. I need the Q4 performance summary in a specific format, not the standard board document, something more direct. Numbers up front, narrative second. I want them reading the performance before they read Hayworth's framing. I can have a draft to you by end of week. End of Wednesday. End of Wednesday. She started writing. He started building the document structure. The room filled with the particular silence of two people working toward the same thing, which was a different quality of silence from any other. Focused, shared, purposeful. At some point in the late morning, she said without looking up, You know, when I hired you, I expected you to be gone by the end of the first day. I know. The agency told me they'd sent me their most resilient candidate. 3 of the 11 had come from that same agency. How long did they last? The longest was 6 days. She turned a page. I was trying to drive people away. I knew I was doing it. I didn't care. She said it with the same clinical tone she used on difficult facts. It was easier to have people leave than to have them stay and see. It was just easier. I know, he said. You figured that out quickly. 2nd week. She looked up, briefly. And you stayed anyway. Sophie needed new shoes. A pause. That's the only reason? He considered his answer. It started as the only reason. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at her document, and he did the same, and the morning continued. The document was on her desk by Tuesday afternoon. She read it that evening and sent him a list of 12 revisions at 9:42 p.m., which he had expected and had stayed up to receive. He worked through them and had the updated version in her inbox by midnight. She read it and approved it at 12:17 a.m. with a single word, good. He was asleep by then. He saw it in the morning. He thought about the fact that she was awake at 12:17 making document revisions and felt a complicated mixture of admiration and something adjacent to worry, which he recognized as a line he was getting very close to crossing without having decided whether to cross it. He crossed it the next morning. It started because of coffee. She had been skipping breakfast consistently for 3 weeks. He knew this because the kitchen log's Mrs. Paulson kept for the medical schedule showed nothing in the morning, and because he'd started noticing around 11 that she was sharper in the specific way of someone running on empty. On Thursday morning, he brought a plate from the kitchen without being asked and set it on the corner of her desk. She looked at it. She looked at him. Mrs. Paulson made it, he said, which was true. I didn't ask for it. I know. She looked at it again. I don't eat breakfast. You used to. Mrs. Paulson mentioned it. Mrs. Paulson talks too much. She's worried about you. He went back to his desk. You don't have to eat it. She ate it. She ate it without acknowledging that she was eating it, which was very Victoria, and he went about his morning and neither of them mentioned it. But the next day she came in, and a plate was already there, and she sat down and opened her laptop and ate half of it while she reviewed her emails. And that became, like the lunch plates before it, a thing that simply happened now. Mrs. Paulson caught his eye in the hallway one morning with an expression that communicated both gratitude and something more complicated. "You're good for her," she said. "She's figuring out how to be good for herself," he said. "I'm just not getting in the way." Mrs. Paulson gave him the look of someone who thought that was both true and not the whole truth. The week before Christmas, Sophie came to the building again. This time, it was not an emergency. Victoria had, and this was the thing he had turned over in his mind more than once in the days since she'd said it, specifically asked whether Sophie was out of school for the holidays yet. And when Ethan said she started her winter break on Friday, Victoria had said, with her eyes on her laptop, "She can come if she wants. There's no reason she has to sit at your mother's house all day." He had told Sophie. Sophie's response had been immediate and entirely without ambivalence. "Can I bring my good colored pencils?" She brought her good colored pencils. She also brought, because she was Sophie, a book about butterflies she had checked out from the library, a small stuffed penguin she carried everywhere she went, and an agenda that she disclosed to Mrs. Paulson within the first 15 minutes, which included drawing the kitchen, drawing the staircase from the top, and asking Victoria if she would look at the butterfly book with her because, she explained to Mrs. Paulson in great seriousness, "Victoria knows what the chrysalis actually looks like, and I want to check my drawing." Ethan heard this secondhand from Mrs. Paulson and said nothing, letting it move forward on its own gravity. Sophie appeared in the office doorway at 9:45 with the butterfly book and her drawing notebook. Victoria was on a call, the kind of call that required notes and attention and would normally have made any interruption unwelcome. Sophie stood at the door and waited. Victoria saw her. She held up one finger without breaking her sentence on the call. Sophie sat down cross-legged on the floor in the doorway, opened the butterfly book, and waited. She waited for 11 minutes. Ethan watched from his desk without appearing to watch. He watched Victoria finish the call and make a note, and then look at Sophie on her floor with an expression he had no good language for. Something that was not quite warmth, because Victoria Sterling in the daylight did not do warmth the way other people did, but something that lived in the same neighborhood, something that was trying to learn the street names. "Come in," Victoria said. Sophie came in. She put the butterfly book on the desk and opened it to the page she'd tabbed. She put her drawing notebook beside it, open to the monarch drawing. "I want to know if the colors are right," Sophie said. "I drew it from the photo, but photos don't always show the real color." Victoria looked at the drawing. She looked at the book. "The orange is slightly too dark on the wing edges. The borders are more black than brown at the edge." Sophie examined her drawing. "I only have one black, and it's very black. What else do you have?" Sophie arrayed her colored pencils on the desk. 14 pencils, each one labeled in her handwriting with a sticker because she'd lost pencils before and wanted them identifiable. Victoria looked at the selection. She picked up a dark brown. "Try this one," she said. "Lighter pressure." Sophie tried it. She showed Victoria the test mark on the corner of the page. "Better," Victoria said, "but start at the edge and move inward. The wing pattern darkens as it moves in." Sophie tried again. She showed Victoria. "That's it," Victoria said. And for a moment they were both looking at the drawing. The CEO who had driven away 11 assistants and the 7-year-old with her good-colored pencils. And there was nothing complicated about it. It was just two people looking at a butterfly. Ethan looked at his screen and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a long time. They spent an hour on the drawing. Victoria corrected. Sophie adjusted. And the conversation between them was practical and specific in the way conversations between people who are actually interested in the same thing tended to be. Not performing connection, not bridging a gap, just two people looking at the same object and both having something to say about it. At lunch, Mrs. Paulson brought 3 plates. Sophie had arranged herself in the chair nearest Victoria's desk by this point. Not at the desk, but beside it, the book open between them. And she ate her lunch while describing to Victoria, in comprehensive detail, the experience of watching the monarch actually emerge from the chrysalis. Victoria listened. She asked once, "Were you there when it opened?" "No," Sophie said. "It started opening and I had to go inside to get dressed for school, and when I came back it was done." She paused. "Dad was going to wait, but I said it was okay." "You said it was okay." "It was going to do it whether I watched or not." She picked up her fork. That's what Dad said. He said some things happen whether you're there or not, and the important thing is it happened. Victoria looked at Ethan. He kept his eyes on his food. Your dad's right about that, Victoria said, after a moment. Sophie seemed satisfied with this as a conclusion and changed the subject to the butterfly book section on migration patterns, which she had opinions about. Later in the afternoon, when Sophie had moved to the sitting room with her drawing supplies, Ethan was at his desk running through the day's final correspondence when Victoria said, not looking up from her screen, "She's something." "Yeah," he said. "She doesn't perform for people. She's just herself." "Always." He paused. "It used to worry me. When she was younger, I thought she'd get hurt by it, being that open. And? And she does, sometimes. But she bounces back faster than people who built walls." He paused. "She doesn't lose as much when things go wrong because she wasn't spending energy on the protection." Victoria said nothing for a moment. Then, "I used to be like that." "I know. You can't know that. You built a company from nothing at 26, he said. You don't do that by being defended. You do that by wanting things badly enough to risk looking stupid for them." She looked at him. The look was direct and complicated and held something in it that had no name that he had found yet. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I don't know what this is." She said it carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "What is happening here? I don't know what category it belongs in, and I need to be able to understand what things are." He understood the question. He understood it completely. "I don't know either," he said, "but I don't think it needs a category yet. That's not how I operate." "I know, but you've been operating differently for a few months now." He held her gaze. "Some things take time to know what they are." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her screen. "That's a non-answer." "It's the honest answer." A pause. "I know," she said. And that was where it stayed. Not resolved, not named, but acknowledged. Which was, for Victoria Sterling, more than she had allowed for anyone in a long time. That evening, when he collected Sophie from the sitting room and she said goodbye to Victoria with the uncomplicated directness she said everything, Victoria told her the drawing was good. Not the butterfly drawing specifically. The one she'd been working on all day, the staircase from the top, the building she'd been documenting visit by visit. "You should sign them," Victoria said. "In the corner." Sophie looked at the drawing. She looked at Victoria. "Artists sign their work," she said, like she'd been told this before. "Yes." Sophie signed it. She gave it to Victoria. Victoria put it on the windowsill beside the pencil monarch. Ethan held Sophie's hand on the way to the car, and she chattered about something, the book, the pencils, a plan she had for the next drawing, and he listened and drove and thought about a woman in a large building who had turned a photograph to face the wall and put 2 drawings from a 7-year-old in its place. He didn't know what that was either. But he thought, for the first time in a long time, that not knowing might be the beginning of something rather than the absence of it. January arrived the way January always did, without ceremony, without the warmth that December borrowed from its holidays, just the cold fact of a new number on the calendar and the question of what you were going to do with it. The board meeting was on the 17th. Ethan had the performance package finalized by the 10th, circulated to Victoria's allies on the 12th, and by the 14th he had responses from Marcus Chen and Diane Park that confirmed both were prepared. Ewan had responded with a single line. "I've reviewed the Q4 figures. Impressive." Which was, in board member language, about as close to "I'm with you" as it got without being on record. Victoria read Ewan's response at her desk on the morning of the 14th and was quiet for a moment. "She's not going to announce her position before the meeting," Victoria said. "No, but she didn't have to respond at all. She responded." Victoria set down her phone, outside the window. The city was doing what cities did in January, moving quickly, heads down, breath visible. She was watching it without really watching it, which was the look she had when she was running calculations he couldn't see. "Hayworth is going to argue that the Q4 numbers are a single-quarter anomaly," she said. "He'll frame the committee structure as risk management for the board's fiduciary responsibility." So we put the 3-year trend data in the opening section, not as a defense, as context. Before he can frame it as anomaly, the data already tells the longer story. "I added that revision last night." He looked at her. "I didn't see it in the shared document. I sent it to Chen directly. I'll forward it to you." She paused. "It's good. I think it's the version." He nodded. They worked the rest of the morning in the productive silence they'd built over 4 months of proximity, the kind where two people knew each other's rhythms well enough that the silence itself communicated. At noon, he brought her lunch without Mrs. Paulson's involvement. He'd started doing that occasionally in December, picking up something from the place 2 blocks east that she'd mentioned once in passing, the one with the soup she didn't ask for but finished every time. He set it on her desk and went back to his. She ate it and said, at some point, "You know what I'm thinking about? Tell me." Sophie said some things happen whether you're watching or not. She had a spoon in her hand and she was looking at the soup, not at him. She said it about the butterfly. But I've been thinking about it for weeks. He waited. I spent 18 months waiting to feel ready to come back to myself, waiting for the right moment, waiting until the pain was less or the therapy worked or until I felt like the person I was before. She set the spoon down. Things were happening whether I was watching or not. The company, the board, my own recovery. I was waiting for permission to rejoin my own life. Where do you think the permission was supposed to come from? He asked. She looked at him. That's the thing, isn't it? I kept thinking someone was going to give it to me, my doctors, or Daniel, when he stayed. And when he left, I thought that was the answer, that it was proof I wasn't worth rejoining. She said it without flinching, which was its own kind of progress. And then you walked in. I walked in for a paycheck. I know, that's what made it work. The corner of her mouth moved. You weren't trying to save me. You weren't trying to fix anything. You were just irritatingly, persistently there. I prefer consistently. I know what you prefer. She picked up her spoon again. I'm saying thank you, in the only way I know how, which is apparently through soup commentary. He looked at her. At the drawings on the windowsill, 2 of Sophie's, the butterfly, and the staircase, propped where the photograph used to be. At the woman who had turned that photograph to face the wall and hadn't turned it back. You're welcome, he said, in the only way I know how, which is apparently through bringing you soup you didn't ask for. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived right next door to one. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. Ethan wasn't in it. He sat at his desk and managed the day's correspondence with a focus that was approximately 50% genuine. He made 2 phone calls and drafted 4 emails and reorganized a filing section he'd been meaning to get to for weeks. And at some point, Mrs. Paulson brought him coffee and sat at the kitchen table while he stood in the hallway, and they both did not discuss the fact that they were both doing the same thing, which was waiting. The call ended at 2:40. The office door stayed closed for 6 minutes after that. When it opened, Victoria came out with the particular composure of someone who had just spent 3 hours performing calm and was now deciding whether to keep performing it. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. The committee structure was voted down, she said. 4-2. Ewan voted with you. Ewan voted with me. A pause. Warren abstained, which is functionally a no on the proposal. The data moved him. The 3-year trend section moved him. He said so explicitly, which is not something Warren does. She wheeled to her desk. She sat. She looked at the papers there without picking any of them up. Hayworth is going to come back. Yes, but not for a while. And differently. Different how? He lost this one with the blunt approach. Next time he'll try to find an ally he doesn't have yet. He'll look for a gap. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. Which means you have time to close the gaps. She looked at him. I've been thinking about something. Tell me. The accessibility consulting market. I've been reviewing the numbers for 2 months. The landscape for companies building technology for people with physical disabilities. Adaptive interfaces, workplace accommodation systems. The spaces where corporate compliance intersects with actual usability. She pulled a folder from her desk drawer, which told him she'd been sitting on this for longer than 2 months. There's a significant gap between what the compliance requirements demand and what actually gets built. Most of what gets built is technically compliant and functionally useless. He took the folder. He read the top page. Then the second one. He read them carefully enough that the silence extended. You've been researching this for 6 months, he said, since October. Before or after Daniel? She looked at him steadily. Before. He read a third page. The numbers were real. The gap was real. He knew enough about her company's existing capabilities, had spent 4 months living inside the infrastructure of it, to see where the fit was. You'd need to spin it as a separate entity, not a department, a company, with its own board structure and its own equity model so it doesn't get entangled in the parent company's board politics. I know. You'd need a co-founder, Someone with operational experience who isn't already embedded in your current corporate structure. He looked up from the folder. Someone you trust. The room was very quiet. I'm reading you an offer document, she said. Not yet written, but in my head. He looked at her, at the folder in his hands, at the woman who had spent 6 months building the case for something while running a company and fighting a board and teaching herself how to stand again. Victoria. You don't have to say yes right now. I'm not saying no. He set the folder down. I'm saying I need to understand what you're actually asking. I'm asking you to stop being my assistant, she said, and start being my partner, in the professional sense. She stopped. She started again. I'm asking you to build something with me. Something that matters. Something that's about more than quarterly reports and board politics. A pause. And I'm asking in the professional sense first, because that's the part I know how to say. He understood what she meant by first. He understood what she was leaving unsaid and why she was leaving it there, which had something to do with the fact that she was Victoria Sterling, and she built things carefully, and she tested load-bearing walls before she put weight on them. He respected that. He more than respected it. What does the structure look like? He asked. And just like that, they were working. They spent 3 weeks on the plan. Real weeks. Document drafting, financial modeling, legal structure, market positioning. Ethan found himself on the other side of the desk for the first time, not managing someone else's work but building something of his own, and the quality of that was different in every way. Harder, in some ways. He didn't have the safety of pure execution anymore. Now he had ownership, which meant the mistakes were his too. He told Victoria this one evening when they were going through the equity structure and he'd made an error in the projection model that had cascaded through 3 subsequent calculations. I've looked at this twice and I missed it twice, he said. You've been in execution mode for 4 months, she said. Ownership mode uses different muscles. The mistake is a muscle you haven't used in a while. That's generous. It's accurate. She took the model from him and found the error in 90 seconds. Fix rows 14 through 22 and recheck the revenue projection, and stop apologizing for learning things. He fixed it. He did not apologize. It was around this time, mid-January, the plan taking real shape, the professional framework solidifying around something that was also becoming personally more complicated, that Sophie asked the question. They were in the car on a Sunday evening, coming home from Ethan's mother's house, and Sophie was in the back seat and she had been quiet for several minutes, which with Sophie usually meant something was working. Dad, she said. Yeah. Do you like Victoria? He kept his eyes on the road. I work with her. I know that. But do you like her? Why are you asking? Because you smile different when you talk about her. He was quiet for a moment. What do you mean different? Like, regular smiling is when something is funny, but you smile different when it's something that matters. Sophie said this with the authority of someone who had been studying him for 7 years. You do the second one about Victoria. He drove. He thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and then about the 7-year-old version of the honest answer, which was simpler. Yeah, he said. I like her. Sophie processed this. She likes you too, she said, in the tone of someone reporting settled fact. She looks at you the same way. You're 7. I have eyes. He laughed despite himself. A real laugh. The kind that came from being accurately caught by the person who knew you best. Go to sleep, he said. I'm not tired. I know. Go to sleep anyway. She didn't sleep. But she stopped talking, which was Sophie's version of grace, and he drove the rest of the way home, turning over what she'd said with the care it deserved. The first time he said anything real about it was in February, on a Thursday evening when the new company documents were nearly finalized, and they had been working late enough that the city outside had gone to the particular quiet that only happened after 10. Victoria had been reviewing the incorporation documents, and he'd been cross-checking the initial market analysis one more time, and at some point the work had reached a natural pause, and they were both in the same room doing nothing, which was unusual and had its own quality. Sophie told me you look at me the same way I look at you, he said. Victoria set down her pen. She looked at him. She's 7, he said. She might be wrong. She's not wrong, Victoria said. He nodded once. I don't know how to do this, she said. I should tell you that. I haven't, since Daniel, I haven't. And I'm not who I was. I don't know if what I am now is Victoria. She stopped. I've been watching you rebuild yourself from the inside for 4 months, he said. I know exactly who you are now. And I know who you were before, from the evidence of what you built. He paused. Both of those people are worth knowing. She looked at him for a long time. Not the experiment look. That was long gone. This was the look that had no name yet, the one he'd been watching develop since November, since the heating system and the two plates and the photograph turned to face the wall. I'm not going to be easy, she said. I want to be clear about that. I've spent a year and a half getting good at being difficult. I've noticed. And there are things I'm still working on. The therapy, the standing. Marcus says maybe March, maybe April for sustained standing, maybe longer. I don't know. I'm not in a hurry. And Sophie? Sophie signed her drawings for you, he said. She already made her decision. Victoria looked at the windowsill, the butterfly and the staircase. Both signed in the lower right corner in a 7-year-old's careful handwriting. She looked back at him. Okay, she said. It was the most uncomplicated word she had ever said to him, and it meant more than either of them tried to translate. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside her desk. Not behind the desk, not in front of it, but beside it, which felt like the right geometry for where they were. She turned to face him. This close, he could see the things her face did that she couldn't fully control. The slight uncertainty she was managing, the thing underneath it that was not uncertainty at all, but had been living under defenses for so long it was still learning how to exist in open air. He reached out and took her hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. Still here, he said. She laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that came from being surprised. Real and brief and entirely unguarded, and it changed her face the way he had seen in the photograph, the one that used to face the window. Still here, she said. None. March came. Marcus called it on a Thursday. He called it matter-of-factly, the way Marcus called everything, which was the right way to call it. He said, We're going to try standing today. Full standing, full duration. No guarantee of timing, but the indicators are where we need them. Ethan was not in the therapy room. He was at his desk. He heard the door close at 10 and he worked through the hour with a focus that cost him more than usual, and at 11:03 the door opened. He did not go to the hallway. He stayed at his desk. He heard Marcus's voice, low, saying something he couldn't make out. He heard Victoria respond. Then he heard footsteps. Not the chair. Footstep. Slow, careful. The careful sound of someone doing something that required everything they had. The sound of someone who had been told maybe March, maybe April, and had decided it would be March. She appeared in the office doorway. She was standing. She had one hand on the doorframe and she was breathing like she'd run something, and she was not all the way steady, and she looked at him with an expression that had everything in it. The months of pain and work, and the sessions he'd heard through closed doors, and the at-home exercises she'd done at 6 in the morning before he arrived, and the day she'd told Marcus, I did it in a voice that was trying not to shake. He stood up. He walked to her. He stopped just in front of her and looked at her, eye to eye, standing, the same height they were, standing together in a room where 3 months ago she had told him she hadn't known what any of this was. Hi, he said. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes got when someone had been holding something in for a long time and was deciding what to do with it. Hi, she said. He put his hands on her arms, steadying, not holding. The difference mattered, and they both understood it. She was shaking slightly, the controlled kind, the kind that came from muscles doing something new and asking every question at once. 14 seconds, Marcus said from the hallway, in the tone of a man writing things down. Don't count out loud, Victoria said without looking away from Ethan. I'm doing my job. Do it quietly. Ethan almost smiled. She stood for 31 seconds before she had to come back to the chair. She did it without apology, without the particular grimness she used to carry when her body didn't do what she asked. She sat down and looked at her hands for a moment and then looked up. 31, Marcus said. I know how long it was. I'm telling you because it's a record. She looked at Ethan. 31 seconds, he said. Don't make a thing of it. I'm not. He was. I was making every possible thing of it internally, in the specific way he made things of things when they happened. Quietly. Completely. In a place she couldn't see because it wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be said out loud. Good work. She gave him the look that had replaced the experiment look. The one that knew exactly what he was doing and had stopped trying to shut it down. Go back to your desk, she said. He went back to his desk. The company launched in May. They called it Meridian Access. Victoria had gone through 11 names before that one. each discarded for reasons that were sometimes rational and sometimes purely instinctive, which was how she made the best decisions. Meridian Access, when she said it out loud the first time, had the quality of something that fit. Ethan agreed. That was the name. The launch event was at a hotel downtown, the kind of space that could hold 200 people and make them feel like they were part of something, which was the specific effect they needed. Victoria had overseen every detail of it with the same focused precision she brought to everything she built, and Ethan had managed the operational logistics with the same approach he'd learned in 4 months of running her life, front-loading the problems, building contingencies, staying 2 steps ahead. He stood at the back of the room while she spoke. He had watched her prepare the speech over 3 weeks. He knew every line of it, not because he'd written it, he hadn't. She was not someone who needed her words written for her, but because he'd been in the room while she worked on it, reading drafts to herself under her breath, crossing lines out, putting them back, working toward the version that was honest rather than impressive, which was harder. She stood at the podium. The room was full. Press, investors, potential clients, people from the disability advocacy sector she'd been quietly building relationships with since November. Hayworth was not in the room. He had sent a representative, which told its own story. She spoke for 18 minutes. She spoke about the gap between what existed and what was needed, about the specific failures she'd identified in the market, about what Meridian Access was built to do. She spoke with the authority of someone who had built something before and knew the difference between a real idea and a presentable one. And then she said something he hadn't known was in the speech. Maybe it was new. Maybe she'd added it that morning and hadn't shown him. She said, "I want to be honest about where this company came from. It came from a 1.5 years of learning, firsthand, what it means when the systems around you don't accommodate who you are now, not who you were, who you are." She paused. "It also came from a person who showed up to work for me when nobody else would, and who had the specific stubborn kindness of someone who didn't need me to be fixed. He just needed me to be there. And eventually I was." Ethan, at the back of the room, looked at the floor for a moment. The applause started and he looked up. She was looking at him from the podium, not performing it, just looking, the way she looked at him now when she wasn't managing how she looked at him. He nodded once. She turned back to the room. After the event, after the handshakes and the press questions, and the 40 minutes of follow-up conversations that always followed these things, they were in the hotel corridor waiting for the car when Sophie, who had been brought by Ethan's mother and had spent the event in a state of focused observation with a small drawing pad, appeared at Ethan's side. "It was really good," Sophie told Victoria. "You understood it?" "Most of it," Sophie considered. "The part about accommodating who you are instead of who you were. I understood that part." Victoria looked at her. "Did your dad tell you that's what I was going to say?" "No, but it made sense." Sophie had her drawing pad open to a page with a quick sketch. Victoria at the podium, stick figure accurate but recognizable. Sophie's specific shorthand for capturing a moment before she lost it. "Can I have your signature on this one?" "On a stick figure." "On my stick figure. There's a difference." Victoria took the pad. She signed it in the lower corner, V. Sterling, and handed it back. Sophie examined the signature with the seriousness she gave all documentation, then tucked the pad under her arm. "Good," she said. The car arrived. They had built 3 things by the end of that year. The first was Meridian Access, which by December had secured its first 2 major corporate clients and had a product in beta that 3 of the accessibility consultants Victoria had brought on called, in various ways, the first tool in this space that actually solved the problem it claimed to solve. The second was something harder to name, the thing between Victoria and Ethan that had started as a paycheck and a difficult woman in a difficult circumstance and had become, over months of accumulated mornings and late evenings and shared lunches and arguments about document formatting and a butterfly on a windowsill and a photograph that stayed facing the wall, something that neither of them had planned and both of them had earned. It was not a clean love story. It was not the kind where 2 people looked at each other across a room and knew. It was the kind that built slowly through friction and presence, and the specific intimacy of being known badly at first and better over time. It was the kind where both people brought their damage and learned to make room for each other's without letting it become the whole of what they were. Victoria was still demanding. That didn't change. She still caught errors with the precision of someone who had been honing the skill for years, still pushed harder than most people could sustain, still had mornings where the weight of everything she was carrying made her difficult in ways Ethan had learned to read without taking personally. She was also, underneath all of it, one of the most honest people he had ever known. Not kind, not always, honest. There was a version of kindness in that, once you understood it. Ethan was still afraid, in the specific way he'd been afraid since his wife died. Afraid of the good things ending, afraid of the moment when something true was taken away. I was better at it than he'd been. Sophie helped. Victoria helped. Not by reassuring him. She was not built for reassurance, but by staying, which was what he'd actually needed. Sophie was 8 by December. She had filled 2 drawing notebooks and started a third. She had a collection of signed artworks on her bedroom wall. 3 of them signed V. Sterling, which she pointed out to visitors with a proprietary pride that was not at all subtle. On a December evening, 3 weeks before Christmas, they were all 3 in Victoria's building. Ethan and Victoria working through a Meridian access board presentation. Sophie at the window with her colored pencils, the city outside doing what it did at that hour, lit and moving and entirely indifferent to the particular warmth of this one room. Sophie said, out of a long companionable silence, "Are we a family now?" Nobody answered right away. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Sophie. "What made you ask?" Victoria said. Sophie shrugged. "We keep ending up in the same place." She looked at her drawing. "My book says monarch butterflies always go back to the same place, even if they've never been there before. They just know where home is." The room held that for a moment. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I think we are." Sophie nodded like this confirmed something she'd already known. She went back to her drawing. Victoria looked at the drawing on the windowsill. The butterfly. The staircase. The record of a child who had walked into a house that wasn't supposed to be warm and drawn everything she saw because she understood that some things were worth documenting before they changed. She reached across and took Ethan's hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There is a version of this story that gets told as a rescue narrative. The man who saved the broken woman, or the woman who gave the struggling man a future. That version is cleaner. It has a clear hero and a clear direction of grace. But that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was 2 people who were both, in their own ways, locked inside the stories they'd been telling themselves about who they were after loss. Victoria had decided her wheelchair was the reason she was alone, because that was easier than admitting she had built walls that would have kept people out regardless. Ethan had decided his only job was to hold everything together for Sophie, because grieving openly felt like failing her. They were both wrong. They were wrong in the specific, understandable way people were wrong when they were doing the best they could with the tools the worst moments had left them. What Ethan gave Victoria was not rescue. It was refusal. The refusal to accept her worst self as her real self. The refusal to be driven away. The refusal to treat her damage as the most interesting thing about her. He showed up. Every day he showed up. And sometimes that is the entire work. Not wisdom. Not the right words at the right time, though there were those too. Just presence, sustained past the point where it would have been reasonable to stop. What Victoria gave Ethan was something he hadn't known he was missing, the permission to want things for himself again. He had spent 3 years being Sophie's father first and Ethan second, which was not wrong, but which had flattened something in him that needed more room. Victoria, who was constitutionally incapable of pretending anything was fine when it wasn't, had looked at him across a desk and seen a person, not a function. She had asked what he thought and meant it. She had built something with him, not for him or because of him, with him, and that had reminded him that he was someone worth building with. Sophie understood all of this better than either of them, because she was 7 and then 8, and she had not yet learned to make simple things complicated. She had walked into a difficult woman's house with her good colored pencils and her butterfly book, and she had looked at Victoria and seen a person who was interesting and worth drawing. She had not managed the interaction, she had simply been present in it, which was all anyone could ever actually offer. The truth about connection, the specific, difficult, beautiful truth of it, is that it cannot be managed into existence. It cannot be performed or optimized or structured to reduce risk. It happens in the unmanaged moments. The 2 plates at noon, the drawing of the staircase, the 31 seconds, the photograph that stayed facing the wall. It happens in the gaps between the strategic decisions, in the ordinary hours when nobody is performing for anyone. Victoria Sterling had spent a year and a half trying to keep people at a distance that felt like safety. What she had actually kept them at was a distance that felt like proof. Proof that she was right about herself. That the accident had taken the part of her that was worth staying for. Ethan Brooks had stayed past the proof. He had stayed into the questions, and in the questions, a different answer had been waiting. This is the thing worth holding on to, if this story is worth anything at all. The wall you build to protect yourself from loss is the same wall that keeps out everything worth having. And the only way through it is not intelligence or strategy or even courage in the dramatic sense. It is the willingness to let one person stay long enough to remind you who you were before you forgot. That person, if you're paying attention, is usually already in the room.